that when the president assumed office, the first thing he did was to terminate them. Thousands of young Ghanaians who have been properly recruited into the public services, terminated.
My colleague on the other side, and my friend, Honorable Oppong, who, by the way, is my constituent also, used to head a ministry called the Ministry of Information. Mr. Speaker, that ministry had 76 people working there to manage government information. Mr. Speaker, as I speak to you, it is myself, a deputy, and 5 other people who now manage government information. Mr. Speaker, these indices point to one fact, that the Akufo-Addo-Bawumia administration have been the worst managers of our economy by far and away. And there can be no
Kojo, Oppong, Nkrumah. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank you for the opportunity to contribute to the motion and the debate before this House. I want to start off by reading a portion of the State of the Nation address and asking my colleagues in the House whether they heard the President say this and whether they believe that this is the true state of the nation. Mr. Speaker, we inherited an economy that was running a high deficit with increasingly high inflation and interest rates. It was also characterized by rapidly depreciating currency. This unstable macro environment created an unfavorable investment environment for both indigenous and foreign capital. That's why we've called the National Economic Forum as an attempt to forge a consensus for a homegrown fiscal consolidation program. Did you hear the President say this? And is this the true state of the economy? You see, this was not in the State of the Nation address. You have just exposed yourselves. It was not in the State of the Nation address. This was not in the State of the Nation address. This was President John Dramani Mahama in 2013. This was President John Dramani Mahama in 2013, lamenting about the economy he inherited from the former president. You know that former president, Professor John Evans Atta-Mills. You can check Hansard. You can check Hansard. There's a similarity between what the president did in 2013 and what he did here in the Chamber of Parliament in 2025. You know what that similarity is? Lamentations. Mr. Speaker, there's a phenomenon where new heads of state spend a lot of time lambasting, berating, demonizing their predecessors, hoping that they will use it as a basis to galvanize a certain narrative about why they came to power. Why you came to power doesn't matter. You are in power today. Your job is to do what? Is to fix it. Mr. Speaker, when a president during the State of the Nation's address spends his time lamenting like he did in 2013 and like he did here last week Thursday, what he does is that he invites the remnants of the previous administration to also come and to do what? To defend our record. In between the two, the real issues that you campaigned on, the things that the millions of young people who were singing Kwen Kwen are waiting to hear you deliver on, they get lost in the cracks. And I want to spend some time reminding you of the things that you campaigned on and the things that many people were hoping that when the president mounted the podium, he will be explaining how he will be delivering on them. The president campaigned on the cost of living crisis. He campaigned that transport fares were high and were still going high, and that if he's given an opportunity to come to power, he will roll out a program to tackle it. Did anybody hear the president here explain how he was going to tackle the phenomenon of transport fares that are going up? He spent all the time lamenting and trying to blame the heads of state of the past, just like he did in 2013. The president campaigned on high electricity bills and the fact that if he has an opportunity to come to power, he will introduce measures to tackle it. When he mounted the podium on Thursday, the expectation was that he will lay out a program, which program we now in Parliament will spend time debating. Did anybody hear the president explain how he's going to tackle electricity tariffs that keep going up? For many months, when the president was campaigning, he was speaking about high food inflation. When he mounted the podium, I was hoping to hear him outline how his program to deal with high food prices. I didn't hear it. I don't know if colleagues heard the president outline it here so that we could be debating it by now. In fact, in the first 2 months of the president's administration, what he has started doing is to remove some of the pillars that helped hold some parts of the economy together. It's not true that everything that went on in the last 8 years was bad. It's not true that everything that went on was good. There were pluses, there were minuses. What we have to be doing now is building on the pluses. But already the president is dismantling the pluses. Take the gold for oil program, which was introduced as a measure to help bolster our currency. It was introduced to, among other things, help reduce the forex demand that was used in importing fuel for our country. Today, the president's new administration says it's dismantled that plus. We are waiting to hear, or we're hoping to hear in the State of the Nation address, what is replacing it so that our currency will not soon tank. What we are seeing instead is a reduction or a drawdown of our gross international reserves to support the currency. And instead, the gold for oil program has been dismantled. Mr. Speaker, the president traveled the length and breadth of this country talking about unemployment. That when the president assumed office, the first thing he did was to terminate them. Thousands of young Ghanaians who have been properly recruited into the public services, terminated. And while the president mounted the podium, we did not hear him outline a program that he's going to use to create or to expand the job creation bracket. Mr. Speaker, another thing that we were hoping to hear the president talk about was the growth of the Ghanaian economy. Yesterday, I heard my brother Ofosu talking about the fact that yes, there had been growth, but that growth, in his opinion, had not been able. The economy has expanded by about $20 billion. The president did not tell us that. I was expecting that the president, when he mounted the podium, if he wanted to give a balanced account, would tell us that our gross international reserves, which he left at $6.5 billion when he was leaving power, when he came back, the morning of the 8th of January, when he reported to work, he found out that it was about $8.9 billion. This is a balanced account if he wanted to give a balanced account. But no. What he wanted to do was to lament, was to complain, was to blame the previous administration. Mr. Speaker, if indeed our colleagues on the government benches want a reset, the first reset we should be doing is moving away from the politics of the past, where new heads of state spend an inordinate amount of time lambasting, complaining, and blaming the past, and spend very little time putting their programs on the table so that we interrogate and support. When many of your colleagues appeared before the vetting committee and Osahin asked them, were you part of the manifesto committee? Have you seen these provisions that your manifesto has made on this subject? They said no.
Deputy Finance.
They said no, they haven't seen it. You would have imagined that by now, the programs for governance, you will be laying them here. And those who didn't see it at manifesto time will see it and even contribute their ideas. We've been in government before. Sometimes you can be here and you see a colleague lay a paper. You yourself, you don't even know the details. But you are part of the majority. You would imagine that by now, your economic transformation program, you will bring it here. Your 24-hour economic program, you will bring it here. These are the things that we were hoping the president will be giving details about, so that by now Parliament will be seized with them and will be interrogating them. Today, none of them has come before us. And we are spending all our time lambasting the past, trying to blame the past, complaining about the past. That's why Ghanaians voted for you. You have an opportunity to do what? To fix it. No, we don't need to wait for the budget. We need to have them here and now so that we can have an opportunity, you and us, to work on them. Mr. Speaker, I'll be concluding soon. 3 major things that I want to draw the government bench's attention to. Number 1, stop the propaganda. You have won the election already. You don't need to do more propaganda. The propaganda will not create jobs. It won't put food on the tables of people. It won't put clothes on the backs of people. Rather, bring your governance programs. Till date, we don't have a single definition for the 24-hour economy program. Everybody you talk to has a different definition. Program Bako, definition bebre. Program Bako, definition bebre. Spend time doing less propaganda and more time bringing your governance programs so that Parliament can assist you and work on it. Number 2, Mr. Speaker, political parties, and this goes to all of us generally, while we do our manifestos and make promises, we should spend more time putting out the granular details of our programs so that in times like this, we'll spend less time doing the blame game of the past, blame game of the previous presidents, and more time interrogating the programs that you are going to govern with and assisting you not to even repeat the mistakes that we made. Mr. Speaker, I thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this.
Honorable Felix Ofosu Kwache.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for giving me the opportunity to contribute to the debate on the message delivered by the President of the Republic of Ghana, His Excellency President John Dramani Mahama, to this House. Mr. Speaker, I have listened in dismay at how our colleagues on the minority bench have attempted to create the impression that the President veered off the requirements of the 1992 Constitution in the delivery of his address to this House. Mr. Speaker, Article 67 of the Constitution is quite clear that the President is to deliver a message on the state of the nation before this House. So if any president came here and focused his entire attention on telling us what the state of the nation is, without going into what plans he has to address whatever problems he has encountered, Mr. Speaker, he will be well within his rights to do so. But right at the outset, President Mahama made it clear that he was not here merely to give an account on the state of the nation, but he was here to tell us exactly what he was going to do to get us out of the abysmal depths into which the Akufo-Addo-Bawumia government sank this nation. And Mr. Speaker, he inspired hope in the generality of the people of Ghana. I have also listened with considerable shock as our colleagues on the other side have insisted that the economy that they bequeathed to President Mahama and his government was anything to write home about. Mr. Speaker, during our days in secondary school, we read the books of the Venerable Professor Na Afale Sakifio, who wrote in one of his books that the lizard says it is not as indignant at the boy who threw a stone at it than at the one who lauded the boy for having a good aim. It is bad enough that they bequeathed the country to the Mahama administration in the state that they did. But it is completely unacceptable and constitutes an insult to the people of Ghana to tell them that the terrible economy that they left is better than the one that they inherited. Mr. Speaker, fortunately, economic analysis is not done in a state of vacuum. Ghanaians have lived through the worst economic crisis in a generation. Ghanaians have lived through the worst economic crisis under the Fourth Republic, if not in the entire history of Ghana. Mr. Speaker, since the year 2020, or immediately after the elections of that year, the Ghanaian economy has been in a tailspin. For the first time in decades, a Ghanaian government defaulted on debt payment. And Mr. Speaker, there is no better measure of the collapse of an economy than the failure of a government to meet its debt obligations. When President Mahama was leaving power in January 2017, Ghana could fulfill its debt obligations. Mr. Speaker, our colleagues on the other side say that the economic indices they left were better than the ones that they inherited. Mr. Speaker, that cannot be true. Mr. Speaker, when the NDC was leaving power in 2017, our debt to GDP ratio, which is a theoretical measure of whether or not you can offset your debt in one bullet payment to the size of your GDP, showed that we could do that with barely half of our GDP and still have almost half to spare on other things. At a point, our debt to GDP ratio under the MPP leapfrogged to 104%. It meant that if theoretically we were to pick all of our GDP and pay our debt with it, we will still require another 4% to do so. It is the worst in our history under the Fourth Republic. Mr. Speaker, the budget deficit is the greatest indicator of economic prudence, because the fundamental principle of economic management is that you cannot live beyond your means. Even in our own lives, if you spend far more than you earn, you would always end up in difficulty. Mr. Speaker, when we were leaving power in 2017, Mr. Speaker, if you look at the exchange rates, in the year 2016, the Ghanaian cedi lost 9% of its value in the entire year. Mr. Speaker, last year, the cedi lost 19% of its value. The year before, it lost 24% of its value. The year before that, it lost 54% of its value. Mr. Speaker, our colleagues claim that they have left a healthy primary balance. Mr. Speaker, the primary balance is simply the difference between your revenue and expenditure minus interest payments, because that is almost statutory. You can't do anything about it. Mr. Speaker, they programmed a surplus or a primary balance of positive 0.5%. Mr. Speaker, I can tell you that on commitment basis, they have missed that target by 800% margin. And the day that the finance minister comes to this house to read the budget, he will bear it all. You cannot have that kind of primary balance and insist that your economy is healthy. Mr. Speaker, look at our public debt. They inherited a public debt of 120 billion Ghana cedis. And I remember distinctly that President Akufo-Addo stood to your right in this house and declared that the 120 billion Ghana cedi debt was unheard of. At the last reckoning, Mr. Speaker, our public debt stood at 721 billion Ghana cedis. Even then, Mr. Speaker, it was because they denied 1.3 million Ghanaian bondholders of the rights to earnings on their bonds. Mr. Speaker, the domestic debt exchange program, as Mr. President rightly noted, is the harshest economic policy in the history of Ghana. 240 billion Ghana cedis, which was due 1.3 million bondholders, were withheld. They were told that contrary to the agreement they reached with the government of Ghana, that they were going to be paid a certain interest rate, it was going to be reduced drastically. The maturity periods too were going to be extended. Even pensioners were not spared the ordeal. So for the first time in our history, our aged pensioners had to picket at the Ministry of Finance on a daily basis in demand of what was due them. Mr. Speaker, these indices point to one fact, that the Akufo-Addo-Bawumia administration have been the worst managers of our economy by far and away. And there can be no dispute about it. Mr. Speaker, our colleagues on the other side also ask that how is President Mahama going to finance his well-thought-through proposals on economic recovery? Mr. Speaker, let me address that. Mr. Speaker, in the last 6 weeks alone, 52 billion Ghana cedis of the debt that they bequeathed has been due for payment. So the finance minister has done what every finance minister has done, which is perfectly legitimate, rolling over the maturities. That is all that has happened. That is the reason why if you pick Ghana's debt today, it has not increased by 67 billion. Mr. Speaker, but I was coming to what President Mahama intends to do to make savings that can be channeled into other areas of expenditure. Mr. Speaker, President Mahama made it clear during the campaign, and indeed, Ghanaians had urged upon the political class the need to reduce the size of government. So President Mahama stated boldly that in the event that he was elected, he will work with 60 ministers. This compelled our colleagues on the other side to immediately promise to work with 50 ministers. Mr. Speaker, these are the same people who defended to the hilt the appointment of 125 ministers. Mr. Speaker, it would interest you to note that the worst economic outcomes that this country has seen emanated from their performance between 2017 and 2020. After that point, all they did was to try to patch up for the wrongs of 2020. That terrible economic performance was brought about by the biggest government in our history of 125 ministers. That means that you don't need a legion of ministers to be able to manage the country properly. Now, Mr. Speaker, I use myself as an example of the savings that are going to be made by having a reduced government. My colleague on the other side, and my friend, Honorable Oppong, who, by the way, is my constituent also, used to head a ministry called the Ministry of Information. Mr. Speaker, that ministry had 76 people working there to manage government information. Mr. Speaker, as I speak to you, it is myself, a deputy, and 5 other people who now manage government information. Mr. Speaker, if you move from 125 ministers to 60 ministers, Mr. Speaker, that means that you are going to buy 60 less Land Cruisers. You are going to buy 60 less saloon cars. You will need to provide 60 less bungalows. You will need to provide 60 less sets of political aides, executive assistants, and what have you. Now, Mr. Speaker, President Mahama has not limited himself to just reducing the numbers of ministers. In any event, as I speak to you, there are only 56 ministers. And in fact, there are 42 ministers running Ghana as we speak, because deputy ministers have not been approved. 4 nominees have not been made to make up for the 60. But if you come to the presidential staff, Mr. Speaker, if you take out the civil servants under the office of the president, under the Akufo-Addo administration, there were 337 political appointees under President Akufo-Addo. As I speak to you, Mr. Speaker, there are 26 presidential staffers, people that you can classify as presidential staffers, and then 4 directors. As I speak to you, if you put together the total number of people who work at the presidency where I operate from, they will not amount to 60, Mr. Speaker. Yet they had 337 political appointees. So this is a man who wants to be prudent. And Mr. Speaker, the reason why that is important is that you send a clear signal to the people of Ghana that you are not here to feed facts on their public purse. You are not here to squander their money on the personal comforts of ministers and political appointees. Mr. Speaker, more importantly, Mr. Speaker, President Mahama gave indication, and I've heard them say that he came here to lament and that he didn't provide a way forward. Mr. Speaker, I have a copy of the State of the Nation address.
1 minute left.
President Mahama was very clear.
Mr. Speaker, he has just started.
Mr. Speaker, President Mahama was emphatic in the address that I hold in my hands that he was not here to lament, even though there was much to lament about. Mr. Speaker, how can we not lament a situation where 1.3 million bondholders are denied their bond savings? Mr. Speaker, they say that they left buffers. Mr. Speaker, when we speak about buffers, it simply means one thing: money that you set aside for the specific purpose of paying debts. Mr. Speaker, the account into which monies are paid for the purpose is what we call the debt service reserve account or sinking fund. Mr. Speaker, they claim that, this is not a fund that they were particularly not fond of and that they didn't use it. This is not true. Mr. Speaker, in previous times, they have made huge transfers into and from this account. There was a time, Mr. Speaker, on 7th October 2024, when they transferred as much as $225 million into this account.
Honorable member, you are time out. You are time out. You are time out. You are timed out. You are timed out.
By the time you came to office,
you are timed out. You are timed out.
In conclusion, Mr. Speaker,
you are timed out.
In conclusion, they left a paltry $64,000 Ghana dollars. Mr. Speaker, we are about to mobilize 15 billion Ghana cedis. So, for them to be able to sustain a claim that they left buffers for that purpose, they must show the account into which 15 billion Ghana cedis was held. I thank you very much for the opportunity, Mr. Speaker.